A lot of what I have to do covers some cultural references, so just to find out where my audience is, how many know who Keith Richards is? Okay, no, you'd be surprised. How many of those people who know who Keith Richards is, how many of you know who Marilyn Manson is? Okay. But you people have no shame. All right, here's one for you. Lady Gaga. Oh, you people are sad. I don't even know who that is. Okay. I ask because there's an interesting story years ago. I was in a bookstore, and I don't know what I was looking at, probably Gary Larson or something, and down the aisle were these two young girls. This is the early 90s, and these girls were maybe 13, 14. And one of them said, "Oh, look, it's John Lennon." Remember John Lennon's famous quote, "We're more popular than Jesus Christ"? So here's this girl says, "Oh, look, it's John Lennon." The response from her friend really made me smile. Said, "Oh, who's that?" But the answer to that question was what I really liked. He was in Paul McCartney's other band. So I will make a lot of cultural references. It's helpful to find out who knows what, so I won't have to explain all of those. So raising a holy family in the culture of death, etc. I have to admit that the title for the talk is somewhat misleading. So let me explain what I'm going to try to do in the next 45 minutes. We're going to look at the connection between music and culture. And we're going to see what music is connected specifically with our culture, and then see the principles of that culture and where they come from. And finally, what ought to be our response to this culture, and what are some tools that we can use to ensure our success. So the whole thing is going to be first a short study of music and its importance in culture, and specifically our culture. That will go on actually for most of the 45 minutes, and then at the end I will give you the remedy. That will be much shorter and easier to remember, which is probably a good thing. It's why you came here in the first place, I think. I hope you don't feel too slighted, but I think you will appreciate the music part of this talk as well. My primary sources for the music section of the talk are Father Basil Nortz's Music and Morality. It's a wonderful 3-CD collection from Opus Angelorum. Also, I'm referring a lot to Eric Holmberg's Hell's Bells 2, The Toll Continues, which I cannot recommend because much of it is rife with extreme immodesty and constitutes an occasion of sin to watch. I had to go to some lengths myself to listen and hide the screen of the TV, and that's how I got my quotes. Holmberg's earlier video, simply entitled Hell's Bells, is acceptable for parents to watch, but has only a fraction of this material. Music and culture. Basic premise. Culture is an expression of a people's religion. Islam, for example, is not just a religion. It's also a culture which springs from the religion. When I say the word Islam or Muslim, you think of religious beliefs, but you also probably think of certain kinds of art and architecture and dress and music and literature. Likewise with anything else, Buddhist, pagan, Hindu, etc. Why is it a valid thing to examine a culture by the music which accompanies it? Because music shapes the culture. Music, like visual art, architecture, fashion, etc., is an expression of a world view. For example, it was no pessimist who wrote Ode to Joy. And one's world view stems largely from one's religious ideas. True, there are moods, etc., which can inspire particular songs, but these merely constitute a temporary and emotional world view. Now, these expressions of belief shape the culture. It's not the belief itself which shapes the culture, but rather the expression of that belief. Music is particularly powerful. Boethius, around the year 500. Music can both establish and destroy morals, for no path is more open to the formation thereof than through the ears. Therefore, when rhythm and modes penetrate the soul, it cannot be denied that they affect the soul with their character and conform it to themselves. Plato. For the introduction of new kinds of music must be shunned as imperiling the whole state, since styles of music are never disturbed without affecting the most important political institutions. Plato, again, music is a moral law. It gives soul to the universe, wings to the mind, flight to the imagination, and charm and gaiety to life and to everything. Music is the movement of sound to reach the soul for the education of its virtue. Henry David Thoreau. Music destroyed Greece and Rome, and it will destroy England and America. Composer and occultist Cyril Scott. Music is not a product of culture, rather culture is a product of music. Here's the reason why. Music is a fine art. Art imitates nature. Now that's obvious in the case of something like a beautiful Rembrandt or a Michelangelo. Even in the case of Michelangelo's first painting, a hideous thing, depicting various demons assaulting St. Anthony in the desert, it resembles nothing that any man ever saw, but it depicts, at the very least, a spiritual reality. The realities which those signs, those pictures or words represent are distinct from ourselves. For example, the word dog. Dog is not in us, but rather the word represents a certain four-legged creature which is a separate and distinct thing from ourselves. Not so with music. The reality that music represents is not distinct from ourselves. It's important to understand that. Art imitates nature, and the natural thing that the art of music imitates is not a thing distinct from ourselves. The reality that music imitates is our own passions, those things within us which often compel us to action and which we therefore must struggle to control if we wish to live virtuously. So music imitates the passions themselves. That is the power that music has. And this is why we can speak about a music completely apart from the lyrics. Music has a message in itself. And thus something like Christian rock is an oxymoron. It sings of virtue while promoting vice. Music forms the passions, says Plato, and when the modes of music change, the fundamental laws of the state change with them. Why? Why does music lead to a change in the fundamental laws of the state? Because man is going to order his state in such a way as to promote the principles that he wants to live by. If music, by imitating the passions, strengthens them and encourages them to the point where they have the upper hand in this war against the spirit, then it is the passions that are going to be dictating the principles, and right reason will serve them rather than the other way around. More particularly, music works for or against our virtue this way. There are three parts of music: melody, harmony, and rhythm. And there are three parts of man: intellect, will, and body. If there is a hierarchy in man, there ought also to be a corresponding hierarchy in music. And there is. The intellect corresponds to melody. The intellect seeks to know things in themselves, the essence of things. Thus, it seeks simple knowledge. And this makes sense when we remember that the intellect is made ultimately for knowing truth, and God, being truth itself, is perfectly simple. No parts, no changes, no decay, no corruption. Thus, the intellect is the highest part of man, and the corresponding part of music is melody. It is the purest part of music because it is the simplest, a single voice or sound at one time. Harmony, on the other hand, appeals to the heart, to the emotions. Experience will tell us that. Typically, we will not use Gregorian chant to set the mood for a romantic evening. Harmony appeals to the will because it has the same end as the will. It moves toward a good. And finally, rhythm, which appeals specifically to the body. Man is a rhythmic being, breathing, heartbeat, the firing of electrical connections in the brain, walking, speaking, all these things have a rhythm to them. And thus someone listening to good music, music which imitates the natural rhythm of the body, can work longer and with more attention than someone who is listening to no music at all. And this is why marching music exists. Not just to keep pace and step, but to keep marching longer and farther. It sustains the natural bodily rhythm. So the three parts of music, melody, harmony, and rhythm, appeal to or correspond to the three parts of man, the intellect, the will, and the body. Intellect is the highest because it is the purest. It has no parts and most closely approaches God. Will is not self-sufficient. It relies on the intellect for order in its actions, but it is still immaterial, and thus it is superior to the body. The body, while integral to the definition of man, is the lowest part of man, being composed of parts and capable of decay. It will not last, and thus it is inferior to the immaterial or immortal soul. That is the hierarchy. Thus, good music, because it is an art, ought to imitate that order. Nature is hierarchical, and music ought also then to be hierarchical. For one of those elements to be out of place, for example, give rhythm the dominant place in your music, and your music is by definition disordered. If there's an order and you take something out of that order, there's disorder. Does that mean that it's bad? Well, there can be legitimate uses for such things in music. To fire men up for battle, you would stress rhythm. To create the right mood for a romantic evening, one would stress harmony. And those are not bad things, provided that it is just war, and provided that you're actually married to the person you're spending the romantic evening with. But in addition to getting the order mixed up, each of those elements can itself be disordered. Melody can make changes in the key signature, or ultimately, as Wagner did, to throw off the key signature completely so that music is no longer ordered and rational, but moves around without rule or direction. Wagner's stated intention was to orphan the notes. Free love, he said, requires free music, not constrained by logic or order. Harmony can also be corrupted by deliberately creating disharmony, that is, competing key signatures, as in Rites of Spring, the Rites of Spring by Stravinsky. Also by asymmetrical measures, combining things of different values. But the most significant for our purpose here is the corruption of rhythm. Very briefly, rhythm is either natural, like a waltz, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, or a two-step, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Or rhythm can be syncopated, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. That'll drive you nuts. Wikipedia has this to say about syncopation. In music, syncopation is when a stressing of a normally unstressed beat in a bar or failure to sound a tone on an accented beat occurs. Syncopation is used on occasion in many musical styles, including classical music. But it is fundamental in such styles as ragtime and jazz, which, by the way, are the immediate parents of rock and roll. In the form of a backbeat, syncopation is used in virtually all contemporary popular music. All right, there's a little bit about the structure of music. We said we want to talk specifically about the music that created the culture we live in today. So, we can have a better understanding then of that culture for what it is and know better how to deal with it in our homes. Clearly, the music of our culture is rock and roll. We'll see that as we continue on here, but I think there's not much point in contesting it. We just saw the order or hierarchy in man, and we saw the power of music to influence man by its immediate imitation of the passions. So let's look now at the order of rock and roll. Excuse me. I know there's water right there, but I have to pour it, and I'd probably spill it, and that would be bad. The order of rock and roll. To be blunt, rock and roll has it all upside down. First of all, it puts beat first, and then harmony and melody, if it uses harmony and melody at all. And topping that whole list is an unnatural beat. Thus, it leads to the passions to action. But no one can perform those actions as a man because melody, the intellectual side of the music, has either been destroyed or is there only to serve the rhythm. Thus, the passions are in a constant frenzied state of activity for its own sake. It has no natural end point, no goal toward which it moves. It's just action for its own sake. Father Basil Nortz points out, then, that I can't get no satisfaction by the Rolling Stones is exactly right. It's constant agitation with no resolution. And this is one reason why we find people who pursue the rock and roll lifestyle can so easily end in despair, burned out on drugs in all manner of perversion and disease. They're trying harder and harder to satisfy their passions, and in trying to satisfy them, they just continue to stir them up more. And the passions finally become completely intemperate, aroused to such a degree that they cannot be satisfied, hence hopelessness and finally despair, a la Kurt Cobain. You know Kurt Cobain? 27 years old, number one in his business, beautiful wife, brand new baby, and he ends it all. If the passions must be brought into line under the intellect, they ought to be tempered enough to be properly subjugated. Later, under reason, they can then be properly inflamed, moderately, temperately, and appropriately. For example, romantic music for a quiet evening with the spouse, or bagpipes for battle. Classical music is cold and sterile if you've always had nothing but rock and roll, because classical music does not fire the emotions the way you're looking for. One has to be trained, because of original sin, to love moderation and temperance. But this is, after all, what we're made for. Virtue lies in the mean. So rock and roll does not cause sin, but it certainly disposes us to sin by teaching our souls to delight in disordered passions. And here's the heck of it all. The people making the music know what they're doing. Music is mysterious, says Keith Richards. Once it goes in, you really have no say about what it does to you. This music gets into them, they will carry it with them for the rest of their lives. Frank Zappa. When you hear my music, that's when you're mine. Prince. I've discovered the tremendous power of music to influence the human mind and body. Mickey Hart, Grateful Dead. At MTV, we don't shoot for the 14-year-olds. We own them. Bob Pittman, producer. The power of music comes from the fact that it plugs directly into the soul. Peter Gabriel. We're playing for the music to go inside the soul of a person. Jimi Hendrix. Music is a vehicle to become proselytizers of a new religion, a religion of self, each man as God. That was the original idea behind the Doors. Ray Manzarek, drummer for the Doors. Remember, this part of our talk is about music, which we have seen and all admit is a causal element in culture. Music comes from religion and it helps shape culture according to the views of that religion. So let's look at the music of our culture and see what religion is behind rock and roll. And by rock and roll, I mean also all its derivatives and offshoots. Just as rock is a child of blues and jazz, so you have emo and goth and speed metal and rap, etc., are all children or mutations of rock. Well, what's the message of rock and roll? What is the formation that it offers our souls? That should give us an idea of the worldview that brought us rock and roll. We already saw the disorder of music itself, so there is problem one. And actually the biggest problem with the music. It puts rhythm first, and it destroys or enslaves melody and harmony, and the rhythm that leads it all is syncopated, not natural. The music, we know, has a message all by itself, but sometimes the lyrics can be useful to see the message. So let's look at some lyrics and some quotes from the world of rock and roll. Eric Burdon, "It's my life and I'll do what I want." The essence of rock and roll is rebellion. The only reason for rock and roll to exist is to be a soundtrack for the movie of teenaged angst and anger. Lemmy of Lemmy and Motorhead. Steven Tyler of Aerosmith. The rock and roll attitude is to do all the things your parents told you not to do. I'm just a messenger, says Dave Sabo of Skid Row. A messenger for whom I don't think we need wonder. Grace Slick holds that rock and roll is in-your-face rebellion. Depeche Mode. I have to feel that sin can make a better man. Glenn Benton of a group called Deicide said that his goal is to create the most evil music, to gain entrance to the 7 gates of hell. When asked if he were possessed himself, he answered, of course. Now, even if statements like that are just for hype, who are you trying to appeal to with that kind of stuff? Who's going to see that as cool? We definitely generate an atmosphere and mood which might be characterized as rebellion, chaos, disorder, and activity which has no meaning. Jim Morrison. Marilyn Manson. We don't write real songs, we produce chaos. Keith Richards. Rock and roll is music for the neck down. Nihilism had become a pop fad. There is pride in being bad. James Miller, author of Flowers in the Dustbin and music critic for Rolling Stone magazine. In 1955, the film Blackboard Jungle came out. The theme song was, quote, 2 minutes and 10 seconds of disorder, aggression, and sex. It's what it was all about. Riots followed the showing of the movie. The music for Blackboard Jungle, Rock Around the Clock by Bill Haley and the Comets. It might seem innocuous to us. Heck, it's the theme for Happy Days, right? But at the time, it was considered tribal. In a world with ordered music, Rock Around the Clock was musical barbarism. 3 chords repeated over and over again with a driving, syncopated beat. Do you realize the longest word in the song is 3 syllables? And that's a preposition. Is it any wonder that this is the nature of rock and roll? Every musicologist says the same thing. Rock has evolved from jazz, and the original jazz music was deeply rooted in voodoo. Michael Ventura, writing for Rolling Stone, in favor of jazz and rock, writes that voodoo aspires to possession, and this aspiration can be seen in today's rock and roll. So just a short word on voodoo. The stated purpose of the music is to accompany satanic orgies with multiple rhythms competing with one another. It sets the passions even against themselves and each other. Accompanied by the use of psychotropic drugs, this music aims at opening oneself up to possession by spirits. And this is not a secret. This is the professed purpose of voodoo. This is why they use the music they do. And notice, too, the involvement of drugs. Drugs and rock and roll. It's not incidental. It goes with the music. It always has. Now recall that music proceeds from a worldview. Islam produces Islamic music. Nihilists produce nihilistic music. So those who produce music which creates an atmosphere of rebellion, chaos, disorder, and activity that has no meaning, what do you suppose their worldview is? What religion do they follow? What shapes their music? Robert Palmer. It's a kind of voodoo rooting in vigorous traditions of celebrating nature and spirit that is far removed from the sober values of Western culture. The whole point of the Doors was to plug yourself into the vibrations of the planet, a pagan mystical Christ, Kundalini power expanding in your body, merging all religions, art, and science. Realize that we are gods. To seek Messiah outside of self is a false Messiah. We saw ourselves as shamans. It was a psychological freak show in the sense of the shaman, the sense of possession. Morrison was the shaman who took people on a mystical journey to a darker psychic realm. Ray Manzarek. I rejoice to see our culture being taken over by joyful young messiahs who dispel our fears and charm us back into the pagan dance of harmony. Timothy Leary. God has come back to us as the four-sided mandala, the Beatles, the means by which to spread the new gospel, music, The sacrament, drugs. Timothy Leary again. Satanic priest Rex Church states that we're using music and art for propagation. And I'm supposing that when he says music, he does not mean Vivaldi. Rock has always been the devil's music. David Bowie. Again, David Bowie. Rock and roll comes from voodoo and brings its energy with it. And what energy do you suppose is that? Let me connect the dots. Diamanda Gallis, quote, "Before shows, I used to pray to Satan, the litany of Satan. My performances were like African voodoo." Tori Amos, "Father Lucifer comes and sits on my piano. I want to marry Lucifer." Jimi Hendrix's drummer, Mitch Mitchell, whose father was a voodoo priest. Hendrix played the same stuff on his guitar that my father played in his ceremonies. Jimi Hendrix's girlfriend and producer both testify to the fact that Jimi Hendrix was possessed, and he knew it. Maybe we can also judge a culture by its heroes. The rock and roll culture seems to esteem a man named Aleister Crowley as something of a spiritual leader. References to this monumental occultist and or his teachings in a positive way are found throughout the rock universe. Sgt. Pepper, David Bowie, Sting, Sepultura, Black Crowes, Daryl Hall, Mudvayne, Marilyn Manson, Jim Morrison, John Lennon, Ozzy Osbourne, to name a few. The list is actually quite long. Jimmy Page bought Aleister Crowley's house and, quote, "employed his system in my own day-to-day life." Aleister Crowley was the most significant occultist of the 20th century. Dying in 1947, he was dubbed in his own lifetime the wickedest man alive. And while one might argue that it's a pretty short list of references who esteem him, it does include some of the biggest names in rock and some of those at its inception. It is, as I say, also a fraction of the list. Not only Aleister Crowley's name, but every demonic name found in sacred scripture can be found in some rock and roll song. The Stones admit their association with Kali, the Hindu god of death and annihilation. And in fact, their tongue logo comes from this association, as Kali is always portrayed sticking out her tongue. So we see that those who bring us rock and roll know the power of music and purposely use it to promote their worldview, which they plainly admit is satanic. It's looking pretty bleak, isn't it? If this is the music that has shaped our culture, then our culture might easily be labeled satanic. Not so sure about that? All of what follows can be summed up in one line, and that one line was given to Aleister Crowley. Remember him, premier occultist of the 20th century, went to live in Egypt because human sacrifice wasn't allowed in England. Anyway, the law of Thelema was dictated to Crowley by none other than the serpent which giveth knowledge, whom Crowley's wife happened to be channeling at the time. The law of Thelema is simply this: do what thou wilt. In the Satanic Bible, it is listed as the whole of the law. The principles of Satanism. Anton LaVey, founder of the Church of Satan and author of the Satanic Bible. Free love is satanic. Promiscuity is satanic. Satanism is essentially selfishness. And then, of course, selfishness is the essence of Satanism. Marilyn Manson, the idea of Antichrist is just the acceptance of self as a powerful being who can make your own decisions. It's not someone with 666 on his head. Manson here does a very dangerous thing, by the way. He's made Satanism commonplace and attractive. Does not our own culture prize, esteem, and value the kind of liberty as the highest good? At the same time, Manson is making the reality of the person of Antichrist look like a myth or an allegory, not a real person as the church teaches that he certainly is. And again, from Marilyn Manson, who, by the way, is not just the godfather of goth, he is also a satanic priest. Satanism is about worshiping yourself because you are responsible for your own good and evil. Contrast that to ye shall be like gods, knowing good and evil. Satan, Genesis 3:5. And maybe the best way to wrap up this little bit about the essence of Satanism is to quote again from Ray Manzarek of The Doors. To seek Messiah outside of self is a false Messiah. Finally, if there is anything horrifying about Satanism, it is that these are the principles that most people live by most of the time, usually without admitting it even to themselves. Gnosis Magazine. The essence of Satanism is selfishness. The message of rock and roll is selfishness. It's my life and I'll do what I want. The essence of our culture is selfishness. Freedom of choice is the law of the land. We live in a satanic culture. And now the happy ending. What to do about it all? This is probably the reason why you came to this talk in the first place, and because nobody else was scheduled at the same time. So I'm sorry if I bored you with the rest of that, but here we go. If the problem is selfishness, what's the cure? We all learned it in the Baltimore Catechism. We're made to know, love, and serve God in this world and be happy with Him forever in heaven. St. John tells us that God is love. So if we're made for God and God is love, we're made for love. Love has two characteristics from which follow everything else that can be said about love. Love seeks first the good of the one loved, and love also seeks to be with the one loved. If love is what we're made for, souls can't help gravitating toward love. Since love is an act of the will, we see souls gravitating toward strong wills, like the battered wife who continually returns to the husband who hits her. She sees strength. What she wants is love, but it's the strength that draws her. Now, there's certainly a disorder there in the use of the strength and also in the attraction that she has. Strength is not the power to overcome one's enemies. That's just brute force. Real strength is the power to overcome one's self. What's the point? We need to conquer ourselves. Be master of yourself, and you've done a lot to secure your children's salvation. You've shown them true strength, not just force. They will gravitate toward you because they will want to please you, because they want the love that comes from a will strong enough to conquer itself. They will continue to believe in love, and they will continue to pursue love, which will ultimately lead them to God. Now, of course, there have to be real and frequent demonstrations of love, both affective and effective, and let's not presume that. Too many parents think showing strength is enough, but it's not. Strength without demonstrative love is also deadly to children, perhaps even more deadly than the selfish culture we live in. But anyway, conquering ourselves sends the message of how strong we are, therefore how good our love is. Thus, others will want to be good for the sake of winning our love. It's what they're made for. What do I mean by conquering ourselves? Well, before answering that, let me make one serious recommendation. Everybody should have a spiritual director. I know, priests are so busy, etc., etc., etc. But priests can't neglect this role. Even if their principal forum is the confessional, they still need to spend time directing souls. And we should all be getting to the confessional at least twice a month, minimum. There is so much grace and healing and guidance and protection that comes there. There are only 7 sacraments after all. They got to be pretty important. Second item is penance. Our Lord says, unless you convert and do penance, you will surely perish. We have to be doing penance. It subjugates our lower passions to the higher faculties. It is the breaking of the wild horses and the cutting away of that anchor that holds us down. We cannot rise in virtue if we are fettered to material things, even though we be praying every day. Practically speaking, what to do? Well, get a spiritual director, or at least a confessor, to give you permission to do penance. Permission is very important because you're mortifying then not only the body, but also the will. But maybe you want to make a list. There's a very practical thing to do. Monday, I'll put a pebble in my shoe just to irritate me. Tuesday, I'll give up coffee. Wednesday, I'll fast. The list goes on and on. There are plenty of things that we can do. Before we go too far, though, let me just throw in a little caution. Define fasting. According to the Church's current definition, it's 2 small meals that together do not equal a full meal and 1 regular meal. Again, be obedient. Do not do penance according to your own ideas. So, there are 3 big tips. Get rid of the bad influences. Bring in good ones. Get a spiritual director, or at least a regular confessor, and do penance. The assumption here, of course, is that prayer and the sacraments are already a regular part of life. Now, those things all lay the groundwork to answer the question, what does it mean to conquer oneself? Without prayer and penance, all our efforts here will come to nothing. So a practical way to conquer ourselves, to become masters of ourselves, so that we are free to really love, and so that our love is good, reliable, stable, true love, based on a conscious decision, an act of the will, simply to have particular things to work on. Mortify yourself, 1, by not worrying about a million things at once. Focus on only one thing at a time that you're going to fix. And that way you also won't be overwhelmed by all the things that go wrong. Yes, of course, you have to try to avoid all sin. But if you focus on one at a time, assuming you've already rejected the idea of mortal sin, focus on one thing at a time and you will see yourself making progress. At first, it will seem worse than ever because now you have it under a microscope. You've singled something out to pay particular attention to. But pretty soon you'll find that day after day, if you persevere, it'll get better, one problem at a time. Let me give an example of that to conclude. Now, I am not supposing in this example that any homeschool moms have a problem, say, with patience. But just imagine for a second that you did. How do you attack that? Well, as I said, classical music will help, penance will help, prayer will help, but focus on a particular occasion of that impatience. Don't just leave the confessional saying, now I'm going to not sin anymore. You have to have that intention for a good confession. Or even, well, that was a good confession. Now I'm really going to be patient. Still way too broad. Okay? Get specific. Have the humility to be specific. Little Joey is a real headache at lunchtime. So here's my goal. I'm going to be patient with Joey at lunch every day. When I call him for lunch, I'm going to say a Hail Mary to myself, and then I'm going to be all smiles. Work to control yourself then at lunch. Maybe Joey needs a spanking. Maybe anger is the proper response to something that he does. Okay, but always in control of yourself. It's not the anger that does the punishing. It's a useful tool to help get a job done. But you, using the anger, address a real problem. That will not just win their conformity to your rules, but their admiration, their desire for your friendship. And then they will be good for you, not just because of you. They will work hard for love that comes from that kind of will, a will strong enough to conquer itself, because they are made ultimately for perfect, reliable love. They will be drawn naturally to real strength, someone who can conquer themselves. Each night, count your failures at the thing you said you were going to work on. Count your successes too, and thank God for the good, be sorry for the bad, and resolve to do better tomorrow. In the morning, remind yourself, this is what I'm working on. Here's how it went yesterday. I have to do better today. God, help me do better today. One specific thing at a time is how we will grow in virtue, and the virtues are all connected, so if you're growing in one thing, you're growing in everything. Homeschooling has many advantages, but the greatest is that your children can be exposed to virtue, to learn what love really is, while being protected from the selfish, that is satanic, culture around us. To learn that love is reliable and stable, and with that, they will continue to pursue love all their lives. Virtue will be attractive to them. In turn, they will learn to conquer themselves, that is, to be truly strong. And that is also how they will find their way in God's world, finally, to God Himself. So a final review. We live in a rock and roll culture. Rock and roll promotes selfishness. Our culture is selfish. Selfishness is the essence of Satanism, so it seems plain that our culture is satanic. The opposite of selfishness, and therefore of Satanism, is love. Love is an act of the will whereby we desire what is best for the one we love and to be with the one that we loved. So logically, we want the best thing for the one we love. We want to be the best thing for the one we love. Since love is an act of the will, and since man is made for love, man can't help gravitating towards a strong will, and to ensure that the love he is getting is reliable. The strong will, we know, is not just someone who can conquer others, but someone who can conquer himself, both his own disordered will and pride, and also his passions. The basic means for doing this: prayer, penance, making progress against one fault at a time. Have a plan, not just a good intention, for the road to hell is paved with such. The devil loves good intentions. He knows they don't go anywhere. What he hates is a concrete plan. And hence the best reason for homeschooling. You can create an environment in which these things are possible. Even, as Father Hardin said, if you just stay home and play checkers with them. I would thank you all very much for being parents and for homeschooling, and know that you are in my prayers, and know that God's grace is always sufficient. And likewise, I ask you to pray for me, and I will leave you with my blessing. Benedictio Dei omnipotentis, Pater et Filius et Spiritus Sanctus, descendet super vos et manet semper. Amen.